Hey guys, welcome to social studies class and another attempt at making you guys a video. So today I'm going to introduce our new unit on the Age of Exploration. This is where we're going to finish out the year, and it's going to be full of some exciting stuff as the world really starts to come together and different continents come into contact with each other and chaos ensues. But that world shapes the world we live in today. And that's what we're going to start looking at. So I have this lovely map here showing kind of some of these trade routes. The blue there is the Silk Road, kind of trading from China to Europe in the old-fashioned way. And then you'll see some other routes, red routes going to the Americas, green routes going around Africa and through to Indonesia, and the world really being pulled together as a whole into one combined unit. Everybody discovering where everybody else is, what they have there, and what they might want from them. So how did they explore is a really good question. And the answer is kind of like this, in big wooden ships that were at the mercy of the wind. I want to set off, this is really a time when, for Europeans who are doing the large part of this exploration we're looking at, they didn't know what was out there. The edges of the map were darkness. They were mystery. They believed the world was round. That's why Columbus tried to sail around it, trying to get to the Indies. But again, it was here there be dragons. Nobody knew what was going on. And so people would jump in these boats and they'd sail for months and years, and they'd get sick, and they'd risk starvation, and they'd risk getting lost, or this piece of wood springing a leak and dying. It really was an incredible act of bravery. They went off powered by the wind with crude instruments to judge where they were latitude and longitude by the stars and other things, and hope they made it back one day. And they went and they drew the map in as they went. So again, they went off the edge of the map. Whatever they found, they added to the map, which is really an incredible, brave thing to think about. It's like for us space exploration today, we think about going beyond the solar system and we don't really know what's out there. That's what this was like for these explorers. Nobody knew it was out there. And just like you might think of space, and like there's so many things that can go wrong, and your ship could punch a hole, or your suit, you could run out of oxygen. That's how it felt. You were trapped on this ship, and that was your only safety. And if anything went wrong, there was nobody anywhere nearby to help you or to save you. So it maybe is a good way of thinking about what the Age of Exploration was like for Europeans at the time. And they had the best technology of the time, just like our astronauts do today. But just like if you watch sci-fi like Star Wars or Star Trek, our technology seems incredibly primitive. So to us today, this seemed incredibly primitive. So they jump in these ships and they go off and they explore and they meet people, and they don't know their language and they don't know anything about them, and they dress different and they act different. And it's not like today where we can go online like, oh, that's what a French person sounds like. Parlez-vous français? Or, hey, Russian people wear that kind of thing. Or where we've all kind of adapted globalized norms. Everything was truly unique, unknown, and they ventured forth into it in this time. What were they after? What drove these explorers? What could possibly motivate you to leave your home and your family and your friends and everything you know for months or even years on end, not knowing if you would make it back or not? What would make someone pay the money to send a ship across the ocean, which might sink or get crashed in a storm or get attacked by pirates or get eaten by a giant sea creature? There aren't really giant sea creatures that ate ships, but they didn't know that. And there's some pretty crazy sea creatures out there, so not a crazy thing. What? Three things. Number one was God. The Europeans were motivated. Many of these were Christians who were seriously motivated by finding new peoples and sharing the gospel with them and converting them to Christianity. Now, their methods were not always great, but a major motivator for many of these expeditions was Christian kings like Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, who wanted, honestly, to spread Christianity to new lands, to find new areas to influence and to share about them with them. So that was the number one motivator. And a lot of these expeditions had priests or missionaries that went along with them. And as soon as they found a place, or certainly right after the expeditions, a priest or a missionary would be sent out to go and try to share Christianity with those people. Some of these priests did incredibly good things in trying to help the natives and trying to protect them from greedy explorers and conquistadors. We'll talk about them later. Some did not, but there are some great stories. Some of our best actual records come from early priests who tried to protect the natives and get the Europeans to view them as people worthy of value rather than conquest. Number two, though, and here's the problem that those priests faced, is the second motivation was gold. Gold, gold, gold. Money. Money, 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 money. What drives people to explore? The thought of profit, the chance to make money, the chance to get rich. And so almost every single one of these men who went out on these journeys risking their lives was risking them because they believed there was a real chance they could get rich. And if these journeys were successful, often they could come home and they could retire. I did my 2-year journey. I bought my house. I have my butler and all the food that I could need. I'm taking care of my wife and children. Life is good. They could retire because they could make so much money if it was a really successful trade mission. If they found a place where they could get something really valuable for cheap and fill their ship full of it and make it back. So gold was a major motivation. The people who sponsored the journeys and paid for the ships often got a huge profit off of them. The kings who sponsored them became rich off of them. And so that was a demand, though. But that meant that when these journeys went out, if they didn't find anything valuable, they were often considered a failure. They might discover an entire new continent. They might make first contact with a whole new country, a whole new people, with a whole new culture and art. But it wasn't considered a success unless you made money for your sponsors. That's going to drive some of these more problematic actions. Massacres, when trade turns to piracy, that the Europeans are doing to make sure they make money, and intimidation. And so it becomes this quest for gold, for silver, for anything valuable they can fill their hold with so they can go back as a success and retire and be rich. And the third G of exploration is glory. And that's just the fact. A lot of these explorers, we're talking about them today, so it worked. They wanted glory. They wanted to become famous. Maybe they were a lesser son of a noble family who would never take over the family, and so their way to achieve glory was to go out and get rich or explore something. America is called America because a guy named Amerigo Vespucci explored the coastline. His name is on the continent, north and south, both continents, America. Amerigo Vespucci. Glory. Christopher Columbus. Famous. Magellan. He's famous. This sense of if I return with great wealth, having discovered something like the Straits of Magellan that he discovered, straits named after him, passageway, major change in the world, I will have glory. And that drove people who sought to be known, who sought to be named, who sought people to recognize them and to live that kind of life. But what did they really want? This. Mr. John, why am I looking at a weird fruit? Because you're not. You're looking at nutmeg. Nutmeg was the king of spices. In medieval Europe, during the height of the Black Plague, when a third of the population was dying, people came up with this crazy idea. You know what cures the Black Plague? Nutmeg! Just like today in the coronavirus, all sorts of people are saying things cure it that don't. Same idea. I don't think nutmeg ever cured the Black Plague, but people believed it did. And as long as they did, they would spend anything for nutmeg, because if you think you're gonna die, you will spend a fortune to not die. So nutmeg, this rare spice that nobody in Europe knew where it came from, that was super rare and super expensive, becomes the world's great luxury good. And a ton of these explorers, what they're really looking for is the source of nutmeg. Columbus finds America looking for nutmeg, which is only found in Indonesia, in the Banda Islands at the time, a very tiny little patch. I'll show you later, either on one of these videos or in class, way out in the middle of nowhere. But it's where the only place in the world where nutmeg grew at this time. And so they're looking for that. Magellan circumnavigates the world, looking for the source of nutmeg. Da Gama makes his way all the way over to India, looking for nutmeg around Africa. These journeys are driven by finding the source of the nutmeg, because they knew if we could just find the source of the nutmeg, you get a bag of nutmeg and you can retire for life, not to mention a ship full. You bring back a ship full of nutmeg and you are going to be like the richest man alive. And if any European power could take over the source of the nutmeg and find it, then that country could sell it to everybody else and become incredibly, incredibly rich. Psst, the Dutch will succeed for a while. And that's why Indonesia is so crucial. They were really looking for Indonesia, not Jakarta, not Java, Band Islands, little tiny islands out in the middle of East Indonesia. But the whole quest, the whole exploration journey was about trying to find a certain set of islands in Indonesia and connect those islands to Europe. So, gotta keep that back in mind. What about the natives? One last sort of section here in my intro. Here's an awesome picture, right? It's the first Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving is one of my favorite holidays in the US. We eat a bunch of turkey and we celebrate this time when the natives came and we had a harvest and we survived because the first settlers were mostly just dying in the winter and starving to death, and they got past winter and they got to the harvest and there was all this food, and so they had this big banquet, and here's the woman feeding the natives, and everybody's standing around happy, and the kids are playing with the dogs, and it was just hunky-dory. The Europeans just showed up and palled around with the natives, and then they just disappeared. No. That's not what really happened. I mean, there was kind of a first Thanksgiving, but it was... Anyway. This is a bit more accurate of what happened when the Europeans encountered the natives. They killed them. They fought them. There were some peaceful times, but for the most part, what happened is the Europeans took their land. And then eventually, if the natives fought back, the Europeans fought back. And superior weaponry led to a fair number of slaughters in the Americas, but also in Indonesia. We'll get to it next year when we talk about colonial Indonesia and what happened when the Dutch did take the Banda Islands. It wasn't pretty. And it wasn't just this kumbaya, everybody hang out together. It almost always led to conflict. Sometimes there were peaceful negotiations, but very often, especially once the Europeans established a principle, as long as they had superior firepower, it ended very, very poorly for native populations. And that's one of the reasons that this is significant, because this is a period that's going to begin the dominance of Europe over global politics. The rise of these countries that are going to take us to World War I and World War II in modern history, where now Europe is kind of on the way down. And new countries are rising, but where this world we live in was shaped by European domination, European colonization, and superior European firepower and technology. So what exactly did they have? Three things. How did they overwhelm nations? How did small European armies overwhelm huge native armies in Indonesia and in the Americas and in South America and eventually in Africa? Well, it's been argued by a man named Jared Diamond, who's wrote a number of books on the topic, that it was a combination of three things: guns, germs, and steel. So number one is the Europeans had guns, and better guns, and almost none of these native countries had guns. Guns were not terribly accurate, but they were terrifying. They were loud. They killed you. Some of these native populations fought wars that were not really about killing, but more like a sport, especially in South America. So the natives get out and they're not trying to kill you, and the Europeans are definitely trying to kill you, and their guns kill you. So there's a shock factor as well as danger factor. Steel. This was way more important probably than guns, is the Europeans had steel swords, which were stronger and sharper and harder than anything the natives had in these areas. And so they could break native weapons. They could slice through native armor. The Europeans had steel armor, and natives attacking them with inferior weapons just bounced off that steel armor. And so while some Europeans died, a single European soldier armed with steel and a gun, cannons in their ships, could devastate a large number of native warriors unless they were really, really outnumbered and the natives were really, really tenacious and brave. So the Europeans are going to use shock tactics. They're going to use superior steel and guns. And there isn't anything the Europeans intentionally did, because sometimes they did die and sometimes they were overwhelmed and sometimes there were things. But way more natives died from disease than from any aggressive action by the Europeans, because when the Europeans show up, they accidentally bring disease pandemics. We are living in a pandemic right now, so you can understand how difficult that is. Now go back in time with no social isolation and no internet and no ability to just stay home. Smallpox will ravage native populations that have never faced this disease before. It's a novel disease, just like the coronavirus is now. There is no immunity. Europeans died of this disease, a lot of them. But when it hit the Americas, it's argued it wiped out 90% of the population. The last 10% couldn't stand up and defend themselves. And unfortunately, that was one of the lasting legacies of the Age of Exploration.